And again, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. We're hoping to keep this meeting to an hour and a half, but definitely want to leave time for comment. I wanted to just call attention to who we have here from the city. Myself, Darlene Wynn, the planning director. We have Emily Hutchings, the assistant planning director, and Chelsea Zakis, who is our associate planner, as well as thank you to Russ, our IT, representing our IT department and working behind the scenes. I will let UTL introduce themselves, but the mayor, I believe, is also, I know is also here, but wanted to give a little brief introduction. So Mayor, go ahead.
Thank you, Darlene, very much. Thanks so much, folks, for being with us this evening. If you have friends, neighbors, family who don't get to be part of the meeting tonight, it is being recorded and we'll make it available for people to look at afterwards. So just a couple thoughts. First, as Darlene said, Taskina, Tim, and Andrea are our team, our consultants from UTL. Some of you will remember them. They were the consultants the city hired to take us through the master planning process a few years ago. And they're here doing fantastic work, helping us to work through design standards and guidelines. Darlene's going to give you much more detail. Let me just say, during the course of this, there's a presentation from Darlene, followed by a presentation by UTL. After that, we're going to go to Q&A and discussion. So what you can do as attendees, participants in this meeting, you can send questions along at any time during the presentations to the panelists. And what we'll do is we'll try to answer those after the presentations. So if you get any questions that come up, feel free to send them. And then once we get through the presentations, you can use the hand raise feature if you want to ask a further question or make a comment, share a discussion point or any perspective you have, which will take place, as I said, after the presentation. So thank you all so much for being here. Darlene?
Oops, sorry. Jump ahead, yes. Thank you. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of where we are today and what this is. So here, the point of this meeting, the main goal of this meeting is to talk about design standards, which is a project that came out of one of the recommendations from the master plan, but also in discussion over recent development going on downtown, it became clear that we needed to take another look at our design standards that are in the zoning ordinance. And so we, as part of this project, put out an RFP for a consultant, as the mayor said, hired UTL to help us take another look at what we have right now are design guidelines in our zoning ordinance that the design review board looks at in all recommendations to the planning board, and they use as guidance in reviewing development applications downtown as well as other areas throughout the city. What we're looking to do now is to create design standards, which are there's two different elements. So design standards and design guidelines work together, but the design standards are written into the regulations. So they are more of a legal requirement than guidelines. If the name makes any sense, like guidelines provide guidance, there's a little bit of flexibility. There's the option for interpretation. And we like that. We want to be able to be creative and allow developers to be creative in the projects they propose, but there are certain elements that we also think need to be more clear. That helps both the public when they're looking at new projects, but also the developers, people who are interested in doing work in the city, know exactly what the policies of the city are and what the community is looking for. So that is why we're undertaking this project. Phase one of this is looking at the Bass River, and that is primarily because we've already been moving along on the Bass River rezoning project. And I will see. So as you know, many of you may have been in our September meeting where we talked about the goal to rezone the Bass River with the Bass River Overlay District, 14 plus or minus acres of area adjacent to the Beverly Depot train station, which as identified in the master plan and back in our 2002 master plan and in the Bass River Vision Plan from 2014. This has consistently been identified as a primary transportation-oriented development opportunity in the city. And so these are two different projects, but at this point, they come together. And here today, we really hope to talk about the design standards component of what the Bass River Overlay District could look like. identify community priorities and goals, and really help to illustrate that for you. The goal, just to get you up to speed too, of the Bass River Overlay Project, we hope to continue to have a robust engagement process throughout the next few months, and have a final ordinance before the City Council in March. We've been compiling questions that we've got from our meeting in September and a couple follow-up meetings, and we are working on a frequently asked questions document to kind of get some of those other responses to you. Let's see, but this is, as I said before, kind of a combination of both the design standards, this meeting, and the Bass River Overlay Redistrict Zoning, but I do hope to focus, and UTIL's presentation will focus on the design standards piece of it. So as I mentioned, both of these projects are consistent with the master plan. It was a result of 1.5 to 2 years of robust community engagement and really hearty and healthy discussions about redevelopment opportunities downtown and throughout the city, and other objectives of long-range planning for the city. But two of the key goals, or actually one goal and sub-goal, was that, and this is one of the goals that we're working on here, is to promote transit-oriented development in the Bass River area to address housing and economic development needs in an environmentally sustainable manner. That is a abbreviated version of the goal. It's much longer, but also then one of the sub-goals is to establish design guidelines to create new walkable neighborhoods in the Bass River area that is evocative of historically industrial character while responding to mixed-use commercial district. The sub-goals also include providing access to meaningful public open space and sustainability and resiliency. And all of those kind of fall under this goal and are things that we've been looking at and are continuing to look at. We wanted to take a moment too to thank the Design Standards Steering Committee that we've established and set up to help us guide this process. They've really provided a lot of wonderful feedback in our first few meetings. They are Todd Rotundo, the Ward 1 City Councilor, Estelle Rand, the Ward 2 City Councilor. Both of those wards are uniquely positioned to benefit and have an impact from this project or the Bass River area. Denny Witten, who's a resident and works in development management services. John Roulette, a resident who's also a landscape architect. Rachel Poor, a resident design review board member and works as a graphic designer. Stefano Basso, who's a local architect, has been involved in the Ward 2 Civic Association and a former Zoning Board of Appeals member. Also, Irina Keefe, a resident and works as our Beverly Sustainability Director. And Chelsea Zakis, who's our resident, our associate planner and our poll coordinator on this meeting and other IT assistants. And she staffs our design review board. So with that, I wanted to also make sure you're all aware of where to find more information on the Bass River Area Rezoning Project. This is a mashup of our website, but go on this website, you can submit comments, which is essentially an email to me. And then there's also a place to sign up for an email list, and we'll be posting documents as they come. We'll post this presentation and a link to the video. So feel free to go on there and check that out. And that is the end of my bit of the presentation. I did want to hand it over to the UTIL team from here.
Great. And I know that Taskina was having, oh, she's back. Are you?
I just got back in.
Okay.
Thanks, Darlene. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight on a Tuesday evening. As the mayor already mentioned, UTIL was heavily involved with Platt and Beverly efforts. So we're really excited to take this to the next stage with you all. Next. The presentation today will cover a variety of topics. As Darlene mentioned, we are looking at design standards across areas in the city, but today we're focusing on, focusing on discussing the framework for how we approach this for the Bass River. The presentation is also a little hefty, so bear with us. There are some areas which are a little more technical than others. So we'll be going through sort of our approach, the design standards in general, and then talk about how we're framing this for the Bass River, thinking through some scenario studies as well as open space considerations that will help us actually, establish proper design standards and guidelines for the area. And then similar to the live poll that was just given in the beginning of the presentation, you'll see that throughout the presentation, we'll be, asking you all to answer some questions, and then hopefully when the presentation ends, we can all discuss answers together. Next. So yeah, we'll begin with looking at sort of the larger approach that we're taking to to the design standards. Next slide. So as part of this process, we're looking at Bass River downtown and as well as neighborhood centers, and the standards for each of these areas will vary, but some may be similar. And if you go to the next slide, Andrea. The way we're thinking about this is really looking at transit-oriented development values and notions, and what we're calling TOD tiers. And we'll explain this a little further as we go through the presentation. For each of these tiers, we're establishing some standards, and then of course each area might get more custom specific guidelines. And one of the reasons we're doing this is, we could take the approach to give Bass River its own design standards, a downtown its own design standards, but really there are some standards that just apply across. So this might become a bigger process for the city to think about other areas in the future. And of course, all of this will be compiled into a dynamic document that we're hoping will be clear and accessible for different parties using it. Next slide. So I just want to quickly note on transit-oriented development for those of you who might be sort of unfamiliar with the term. This is an urban planning and design strategy that really promotes compact, walkable, mixed-use communities around a transit station. And of course, there are various sort of benefits that come with that. We're bringing people, activities, public spaces together. We're connecting people to opportunities and jobs. We're concentrating development efforts and infrastructure investment. It's promoting healthier lifestyles, including walkability and bikeability. Of course, reducing dependency on the car, which in turn, reduces our overall carbon footprint and other negative impacts on the environment. So all in all, it is a longer-term strategy for sustainability, equity, and prosperity. But something that's really important that is TOD is not a blanket approach, that can just be applied across the same in all areas, and especially in Beverly, given the different transit stations and different bus networks, it's really important to understand what kind of development makes sense in each area, and this is partly determined by sort of transit connectivity, the urban activity that already exists, and of course larger economic and market considerations. Next slide. And as we continue to think about what TOD, means and how it is applied across different areas in Beverly, we're also actively looking at current regulations that are, might be set. One of them being draft guidelines that affects the housing choice law for Mbta communities. And Beverly is an Mbta community, and this law would require at least one zoning district, in an Mbta community to allow multifamily housing by right. Of course, this law is not enacted per se, but it's something that we are actively looking at as we frame the standards for these different areas. Next slide.
So what we were asked to do by the city is both think specifically about the Bass River area and its relationship to Rantoul Street as a kind of pilot project here. But Darlene and the mayor asked us also to think about it as a modular approach in terms of the structure of that we think about it that could be applied to other TOD locations in the city. And we thought that the best way to begin to frame a structure for thinking about this was to make the regulations very transparent around two qualifications. One is the number of floors you could build in different kind of neighborhood centers and TOD districts. And so you'll see it ranges from 5 stories and 4 stories in downtown on the Bass River to 3.5 stories, which means 3 stories with a pitched roof in medium-sized neighborhood centers, and then 2.5 stories, which means 2 stories and a pitch roof in small neighborhood centers. And the name of the TOD tier would be, essentially the number of stories that were allowed, so that the rule set at a basic level was very transparent to community members, to developers, to advocacy organizations, whatever their interests might be. Next slide, please. The other thing that we thought could make the design standards easier for people to understand, that in each of those TOD tiers, there would be different sizes of maximum floor plan areas you could have for a building. And so on Rantoul Street and on Bass River, it might be 5 stories, allowing maybe a 30,000 square foot a floor plan for just one of the floors of the building. Maybe in certain parts of the downtown where you want a slightly smaller building, it might be 4 stories and 20,000 square feet, and to be worked out still based on the size and the existing density of other neighborhood centers in Beverly. It might be 3.5 stories and 5,000 square feet, or 2.5 stories and 3,000 square feet. None of these metrics are fixed yet. What I'm really explaining here is a methodology that starts with building size and height as a starting point. It gets to the resulting size and shapes of the building more transparently than a lot of regulations tend to do, whether it's floor area ratio or other tools that are used where you only know the size of the building form after you take other steps. This puts up front transparently as the organizing principle how big and how tall the buildings can be. And this is what you're going to see. This framework for thinking about development regulations as the starting point for a longer list of design guidelines is something that we're going to show you in a minute, show you how it might play out in the Bass River area as again, a kind of pilot place where this kind of framework of regulations might play out. Next. Just to give you a sense of actual buildings that fall in these different categories. 5 stories includes some, but not all of the buildings that are being built on Rantoul Street. In some cases, you can even go a story higher. 4-story buildings. And by the way, by 5 stories, we typically mean in the areas that we're talking about 4 floors of uses on the upper floors over active ground floor uses. So this might be called in some context, maybe for those that have been involved with other development review, a 4/1, let's say. A 4-story building is a 3/1 with usually different uses on the ground floor, not always, either retail or lobbies or active uses, and then 3 floors above. And then when you get into the 3.5 and the 2.5, the TOD3 and the TOD2 districts, typically those uses on the half floor are under a pitched roof or there's a considerable setback. And so those are the kind of form-based standards typically for those regulations. But this gives you a sense just visually of the kind of size of buildings we're imagining in the different districts. Next. And then, I think there are lessons on Rantoul Street and other areas of Beverly of maybe what not to do. Maybe the ground floors aren't treated properly. The design standards are going to make sure that we don't have buildings where the windows just march to the ground floor with kind of inactive blank facades. Or there might be buildings that are overly large in certain areas of Beverly that maybe the city doesn't want to repeat again because those buildings are out of scale. Or there might be design features we think we want to build into the design standards that can keep projects from happening that people aren't happy with from an aesthetic standpoint. So we'll start with floor area size, and we'll start with number of floors, but then
Tim,
we'll be—
Tim,
yeah.
One quick sec, I apologize. I think for people who are very familiar with the neighborhood, I just want to point out that where it says 76 Rantoul Street, I'm pretty sure that's the newer building in the Gateway condo. Darlene, that's what it looks like, which would be 60 Rantoul. Just because somebody might get hung up on the number like I just did.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Anyone, anytime in the chat, if there's any mistakes, flag it in the comment button and we'll duly note it. Thanks. Next. So I'm going to turn it over now to Taskina to talk about how this general framework might apply to the Bass River.
Thanks, Tim. Andrea, next slide. So as part of phase 1 of this process, we're taking a closer look at how we approach the design standards of the Bass River. Based on both the TOD tiers that Tim just talked about, but also specific guidelines that could drive some of these design standards. The Bass River has close proximity to Beverly Depot, so it's an excellent area for transit-oriented development. It's within 5 to 7 minute walking distance, at least the majority of the southern section of the Bass River. And like other established neighborhoods, the Bass River also presents a great opportunity to think afresh, for what a vibrant mixed-use neighborhood could really look like. Next slide. So given that, it's very important that we set these design standards and guidelines for what kind of development and character that we'd like to see happen. And there are many reasons why this process is particularly important for the Bass River. It's been identified for a rezoning throughout several planning efforts throughout the 2002 master plan up to the 2020 updated master plan. And we can really use this rezoning effort to think through some of the design and dimensional standards that we all want to see there, including the character of spaces, how we think about access to open space, even circulation and branding of the area. And of course, we also want to use these design standards to set, precedent and guideline for how the area should think about future development and how it incorporates and prioritizes sustainable development and strategies to make the riverfront more resilient. Next slide. So I'm going to quickly, take us through some framing of the existing context of the Bass River, which I'm sure most of you are already familiar with. But if we just look at this aerial image here, with all the sort of talk we just had about, robust transit-oriented development, this image here is currently the antithesis of what TOD could look like. It's largely characterized by surface parking lots and sort of dispersed uses. If you go to the next slide. And these are some pictures also highlighting what the character of Bass River looks like. These were just taken this weekend. So again, large surface parking lots, unfriendly pedestrian conditions, limited access to the waterfront, and really, not taking enough potential of what it could be done over there. Next slide. It's also obviously very important to note that this area is very vulnerable to flood risk. It has increased probability of flooding that requires really critical planning for both water management, climate mitigation, and adaptation. And it really gives us notion to how we should approach the river's edge as we think about design standards for the area. Next slide. And as part of this framing around sort of open space and how we think about the riverfront, the open space is, would be partly determined by Chapter 91 regulations. And, without going into too detail into the regulations themselves, I'll just quickly summarize, what the requirement for open space would be given certain development situations. Next slide. So the rule for the Chapter 91 is, a lesser of 100 feet or 25% of the sort of average distance of the parcel depth from the high water mark line that we're showing on top to the landward lot line. So if you see in the first image, 25% or 125% of that would be either 100 feet or less. If we added a new street in the center, the landward lot line changes. And then the 25% becomes, part of that top parcel there, which lessens the open space requirement. And if we raise the street even closer to the water's edge, that open space requirement goes down again, but of course, no lesser than 25 feet. Again, this is partly determined because the city can, of course, decide, whether they want more open space requirements than, what is suggested here by Chapter 91 regulations. But this, gives us a framing of how we can start to think about what we really want to see happen, in terms of how development actually happens on the Bass River area. Next slide.
Jessica, could I just jump in for a second? Just a follow-up point on chapter 91 too. It's important to note, and maybe you apologize if you're going to say this, that doesn't come into play until a property is redeveloped. So those types of requirements for public open space or water dependent uses or public access, we would only see in the event of a redevelopment.
Exactly. Thanks, Charlene. So if we think about that in terms of, how we approach our larger framework for the Bass River, if we maintain the parcels sort of as they are, the current depths, we see a larger, what we're calling what is called a water dependent use zone. So a larger open space area. If we introduced a new street, if we go to the next slide, which, subdivides the parcels, that open space requirement is then lessened. And then if we raise the street to align with Margin Street, which would, be ideal in terms of circulation, again, we see that we get less open space. Again, next slide, regardless of, which way we go, this area is, very vulnerable to flooding. And what really matters here is that the more open space we have, the more room we have for variability of thinking through different resilience measures. So that's one way of thinking of what we get, depending on how we think about how development would happen on this area. Next slide. I think I'm going to hand it over to Tim here to summarize, the overall trade-offs of these different options.
Yeah, and so I was trying to answer as many questions as I could in the answer thing. So I think there's pros and cons to the schemes, and I think the advantage of the wider public way along the water, beyond the maximization of open space, is that it means that for reasonable redevelopment, you don't need an intermediate street between River Street and the water. And this allows for more flexible development proposals to happen in that zone. But once when the public way is narrower, those parcels get a little bit deep, and it seems disproportionate to the amount of public space that's there. So that's really one of the advantages of the scheme beyond the amount of open space, the flexibility of the larger parcels for developers to respond maybe in interesting and more creative ways. I think the disadvantage of the proposals that propose a new street parallel to River Street is that the city wouldn't implement those new streets. They would be implemented with each development project, and their coordination between development projects would be something that the city would have to coordinate and manage. And that happens fairly often in development today, that the city establishes guidelines so that the developer that builds the next development to that piece of street that's built would have to meet a certain elevation and meet certain alignments. But given the fact that because of resiliency issues, those streets are going to have to be on some amount of fill too, it becomes more complicated to coordinate that. So including that new frontage street parallel to the open space right at the waterfront makes that coordination simpler in terms of the role of the city relative to private development.
Tim,
I think,
could I just ask you, it's not as easily visible that each of these three diagrams shows a parallel street, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
So on the left-hand one, what you would see is a street, and on the river side of that street would be no development, entirely public space.
Exactly.
Just as one of the scenarios. I think that's easier because it doesn't show very easily in the visual.
Yeah, and we'll be getting into some visualizations that clarify that. In that case, that new street would be a kind of promenade street that would be as much the address street for the public space as the address street for the development on the other side of it. In the others, the street's pulled back, and the private development would face that public right-of-way directly, and only the latter streets coming from River Street would provide public access to that street. And that has to do with looking at development scenarios to understand, kind of reasonable parcel sizes for the kinds of buildings that are being built, for example, on Rantoul Street, to understand the general geometries of those things. And I think that the pros and cons are obvious, that there are market advantages for the larger open space, as well as advantages in terms of providing open space and providing enough dimension to deal with the resiliency issues that we're going to be talking about in a couple of minutes. And so I think that, our initial conclusion is that that the first two scenarios are still worth exploring as we dive into this a little bit more. There's still more work that we have to do next. So this is the next poll. Who's the master of ceremonies for this? Darlene, are you?
I turned the poll on. I don't know if you want to introduce the question, or Taskina, if you want to read further.
Yeah, sure. I think we use this first part of the presentation to really frame the issues around Bass River. And we want to get a sense from all of you, what is your top priority for the Bass River? And I know, within all these options, each is important, maybe varying levels of importance for some of you. So when we say top priority, we just mean amongst all of these, what is the most important to you?
But I think it's important to say that, at this point, our team thinks they're all important.
Almost everyone's answered. We like 15 more seconds. All right. Sharing the results now.
Okay, so thanks everyone for answering. Looks like most people would prioritize enhancing open space and creating public access to the waterfront, as well as creating a mixed-use, walkable, and pedestrian-friendly district with new shops and restaurants that keep the streets alive. So after introducing those three different alternatives, we dove into an exercise that we call development scenarios. Before we dive into them, we just wanted to let you know what this means and why we do this. So creating scenarios is a very helpful way for us to think about and guide our decisions on how we could envision the Bass River area, how it might grow and change. And also it serves as a way to open conversations with you and guide us as we move forward. It is important to note that scenarios are not a prediction of the future. We're just bringing these scenarios to open up conversation around possibilities for growth in the Bass River area and to understand what could be the kind of implications for people who live or work in the area. So today we will be presenting two different scenarios. And as a starting point, we considered the importance of existing and potential connections between the Bass River area and the broader context, especially downtown. As you know, there are already some existing connections between downtown and the Bass River, some underpasses where there is potential for improvement in the public realm. And we could think about other connections that could be created, for example, through the Beverly Depot. So the first scenario, we're looking at a public way along the waterfront that could be larger than 50 feet, between 50 and 75. We would create new ladder streets that are perpendicular to the waterfront to really enhance those connections between downtown and the waterfront and allow people to least easily access this waterfront promenade. We would deploy the tier system that Tim described at the beginning, where we could concentrate development of up to 5 stories in the area between River Street and the waterfront, and then development of up to 4 stories in the narrow parcels between River Street and the rail tracks. This area would provide multifamily housing options that are close to transit with a mixed-use ground floor, some green pedestrian paths that connect River Street to the waterfront would be encouraged. And this more than 50-foot public walkway or waterfront park would provide opportunities to really develop some resiliency strategies, as Taskina mentioned. This is the option where we would have most open space allocation for many different types of activities, which we will see more of later. And it maintains flexibility in the development of the parcels here, as Tim described before. We could also take it a step further to make the Bass River area even more mixed use by adding some office or commercial type developments. And the size of this parcels allows for flexibility to either develop housing or commercial uses.
To make a comment about that, if you go back for a second, Andrea, I think partly in a response to a question I answered in the chat, that we want to design these TOD tiers to make sure that those in tier 5 and tier 4, that those upper floors could be commercial or residential. And so we have to be very careful about how we set the maximum height limit to make sure that it doesn't privilege residential over commercial, because I think a healthy mix between the two is certainly good for Bass River, and in certain targeted areas of downtown, it might make sense as well, especially as the market changes, to have a kind of 24/7 mix of uses, so that the Bass River is neither just an office park nor just a kind of bedroom community. And I think that that's good for the activation of the open space and the ground floor spaces as well.
Thank you, Tim. And as Tim was saying, we really want to have lively streets that are always active. And the design standards would also include some guides about the areas where ground floor should be more active by setting some minimum fenestration standards, also requiring parking not to be located in those areas. So we would try to have a lot of retail, small shops, restaurants, outdoor cafes along the waterfront park, as well as along River Street. And then if we go into the second scenario, where we have a public way greater than 25 feet, between 25 and 50 feet, again, with those ladder streets that would connect from River Street and from downtown all the way to the waterfront, and that additional new street that Taskina and Tim described parallel to the river. In this case, we would deploy, again, the TOD tiers, where we would concentrate buildings up to 5 stories in this middle row, and then have a lower height buildings along the waterfront up to 3 stories. And it could look something like this. Again, we have active ground floors along the waterfront and along River Street. We have those green connections that bring people to easily access the waterfront. In this case, obviously, we would have less open space allocation than in the first scenario, but more developable area. And we would have more diversity in building type, building sizes, from townhouses and up to 3-story buildings along the waterfront, and then higher buildings in this middle row.
I think there's one thing that we're going to be talking about in a kind of comparison slide, but the bigger dimension of open space in that Promenade Street, conceptually requires denser development to provide the cross subsidy to pay for it. You can shift to maybe a zone of lower heights, and then correspondingly conceptually, the open space is narrower. So while there's slightly more development area here, half the site is at tier 3 and half of it is at 5. And we haven't dived into the math of this yet, or the fuller pros and cons, but it's just something to keep in mind that all of that open space we're talking about and the new street that connects, we're imagining is primarily paid for through incremental development that would follow design standards to build it out over time. There might be some public funds that could help support some of that, but this is a development model that's based on a private development carrying a lot of the cost burden for some of the public improvements that we're talking about.
And then again, we would also have some active street guidelines to ensure that ground floor along the waterfront park and along River Street is really active. And now I'll pass it over to Tim to talk about the trade-offs between these two scenarios that we just looked at.
Yeah, I think these pros and cons aren't much different than the more abstract diagrams we had a couple of slides back, so I'm not going to belabor these, but it seems conceptually, again, that the higher density development of tier 5 in the first scenario in a way pays for a deeper open space zone, and a waterfront facing street that we should probably call the Promenade, which is also nicely designed. The new street that's mid the development parcels in the 25-foot public way would be a little bit more perfunctory, because that would be probably the service street to access parking and those kinds of things. So the design demands on the Promenade Street would be higher than the design demands on that new street, because in that case, the public would be using the latter streets to get to the waterfront. I think the disadvantage of the second scenario too is that while that's imagined to be a full public right-of-way along the water, in some cases, private development is abutting directly to that without an intervening kind of public street. And so that might send a different signal about how public that feels. Next.
Tim, can you say two quick things additional
Sure.
on that? One, potential for what are showing as streets from the depot to the water, potentially being either one-way, not two-way, or potentially being pedestrian only.
Absolutely.
We've had those conversations.
Yeah, those questions have come up in a couple of the questions in the chat. And I think that whether those are vehicular streets or just pedestrian bicycle paths that connect, and I think their precise location too is going to be a little bit contingent on the phasing of development and where the parcel lines actually are. We've kind of idealized them where we would like them to be, but I think we're imagining in real time the actual location of those might have to shift around based on development. But I totally agree. There's going to have to be the buildings that you see in these development plans need an address, a street address. And so beyond that, for postal deliveries and for buildings need addresses, but beyond that, what that means in terms of the modes of mobility that are being designed for those ladder streets, I think are completely open. Because I agree with a lot of the Linda Blair said, it seems counterintuitive to add a street when you're claiming TOD. It's like, it's true in a way, but there's just functional considerations. And we want it to seem like the public who understands a street as being public can move through that zone and get to the waterfront. That's also an important consideration too. That's a really good question.
Okay, so now we have the second live poll. Again, we would like for you to tell us if development could pay only for one of these 5 things, which one do you think is the most important?
These are even harder choices.
Just 10 more people to answer and then we've got 100%. Like 15 more seconds. All right. And sharing the results.
Just a point I want to make as we're wrapping this up, that, private development can only cross-subsidize so many things on this list. And that's, fortunately or unfortunately, that's how a lot of public benefits are paid for through kind of requirements that are tied to design standards or zoning obligations. And so creating the infrastructure for these sites to both get to the waterfront and provide a kind of resource along it might be most of what these, not the only thing these developments can provide, but is going to have a big impact on the overall financial pro forma and how these projects perform. One reason why we're recommending Tier 5 here, to make sure that the projects are resource rich enough that they can meet the commitments for what the expectations will be with the design standards. But that those projects can't cross-subsidize exceeding your existing regulations across all these categories. It would be unreasonable to expect that, at least at a conceptual standpoint, if that makes sense.
Great. So I know that we are almost at time, so I will quickly go through some of these slides, but we just wanted, to take a closer look at some of these open space and public access considerations, given these different scenarios that we just presented. Next slide. So if we, really think about what a continuous open space over 50 feet could look like versus over 25 feet. There are various, considerations for both activities, but also resiliency measures. So, it's really important to think about what kind of open space are we really aspiring for. And we already see that most people, chose an open space as the main thing they would like to see being paid for by the developer. So I think some of these slides will be, good to talk through and be like, maybe even be excited by. Next slide. So if we think about, just not only the size of the open space, but also, what we can do there, we could think about the Bass River having a more natural edge. It's an example from East Boston, and this is, 25 feet of a living shoreline, with marshes, wetland terraces, beaches, and rocky shores. Next slide. And if we add some sort of more dimensionality to that, we could also add some hardscape, and this is a seawall condition kind of in Lynn. So it's a more passive recreational park. Next. And then another end, is more variability and more activity, but also, incorporating resiliency measures. This is the East Boston Waterfront Park. It has both living shoreline, various flexible spaces for activity, and also, takes into account bike paths and walking paths. Now, the sort of development that we see here is, pretty similar to what we were already suggesting, some of the scenarios, up to 5 to 6 stories. But, the difference here is context. This development is right next to not even 2-minute walk to a subway stop, which can take you to downtown in one stop. And it also overlooks the Boston skyline. So there are larger, questions about, what incentivizes a developer to actually build this kind of space. Next. These other examples that I'll talk through is not necessarily something that we're suggesting in terms of scale for Beverly, but rather thinking about, again, what is the open space that we're aspiring for. So this example from Norway is showing a waterfront with an active sort of, retail front. So some of those buildings that we show by the water could, have commercial and retail activity, which would keep the area alive both during the day and both during the evening. And then ideas of more tactical urbanism through lighting and stepping down to the waterfront. Next. This other example, shows kind of what, again, a little more passive. There's not a ground floor activation happening, but there is a right-of-way boulevard that could, have other people come from other areas in Beverly, sort of park in that area, and then also, have access to this waterfront. And then the pier systems, give variability of, again, different kinds of spaces that could be used. Next. And then for more sort of people who might aspire to more activated, and less passive open spaces, we could have variability along this open area where there's playgrounds and also maybe even covered spaces for events. So there's a lot of things to think about when we consider the size of the open space, but also how we want to incorporate different both resiliency measures and also how people frequent this space. Next. I'll pass it to Andrea. Andrea.
Sorry, I was on mute. We explored what could happen in this open space. This is a 50+ public way scenario that we saw first, where we could have many different types of both active and passive recreation activities going on in this public space. We could also have, as we saw in the East Boston example, a restored natural habitat at the water's edge. The open space is also a possibility to step up to meet active ground floors and the public realm, which might need to be elevated in anticipation of future floods. And also thinking of strategies, as Taskina was saying, to make this waterfront park accessible to the public, in this case, by connecting to this promenade that Tim described, where people could from all over Beverly could come here and park, or could bike here and access this waterfront park. And then we also saw how this waterfront park could look like in the second scenario, where we have a 25 to 50 foot public way again, we could also have many different types of activities, both passive and active, and some kind of strategy to elevate in anticipation of the future flood projections. So this is the third and final poll. We would like to hear about what would you want to see in this linear open space?
I suspect the same 10 are having trouble doing the poll, Chelsea. That's my guess. It's a consistent, we've hit a very consistent number.
Waterfront retail, restaurants, and outdoor cafes. So just to close this presentation and step into the Q&A session, we will continue developing and refining these standards that we shared with you, and your feedback is very important. And we will also produce more custom standards around site.
Some of the questions were technical or really easy to just answer, but we'll go through the ones that are substantive as well as the ones we haven't answered yet. I did want to make a clarifying point, and I know a lot of you understand this, but I want to make sure it's clear that all of these parcels in question are privately owned. None of them are owned by the city. And so the plan that we're showing, these are really schematic plans or ideas of how development could happen in this area, or redevelopment could happen in this area, to help us understand what we want to see and what the regulations and guidelines should frame for that. None of what you've seen is an actual plan that will be built or that could be built later. Things could be different in the future, and we just want you to understand that this is not an actual plan, but it will be used to guide the city in developing the guidelines, and it could be very helpful if the guidelines reflect one of these scenarios and some of these pictures for the city to repurpose and use as a vision for the area. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear before we moved on based on some of the questions. If you have a question and you want to be unmuted, you can raise your hand and we will call on people in order. We do have a number of questions already in the chat, so I will start there. I know we did get one person called in, but I think it's fine. So the first question in the chat is, why is the Beverly Depot inside the district? The overlay is based on the idea of redevelopment and new development. In what way is including the building in the overlay protective of the building in its existing form? Tim, I saw that you were starting to answer. I don't know if you wanted to answer that or you want me to.
I mean, I started to answer and then I realized it was going to be a several paragraph long answer. So I thought it was better to answer live. I think I think the zoning isn't the kind of design standards that we're doing that are, let's say, a precursor to zoning, isn't typically the tool that's used for preservation. I think that, but I think the question about the depot building and some of the older brick buildings with character in the Bass River area itself, I think require our team to think a little bit more carefully about how either to require preservation of certain historic structures if there aren't already other state or federal designations that preserve the depot already, which there might be, and what kind of incentives or disincentives we include in the design standards to require developers to make a case if they can't preserve certain buildings. I think the depot itself should be preserved de facto, but I wouldn't know within our assignment and the scope of this work how that would work, Darlene. So maybe you have some insights about that.
Darlene, could I add to that quickly?
You may.
Thanks, and thanks, Tim. And thanks, Counselor, for the question. I think where we at is we all want to see the building protected and preserved. And we don't want to foreclose the possibility or opportunity in the future for some additional development on that larger parcel, given that it is the train station. It fronts on the transit. So I think that will be one of the challenges in, as we try to put together the right words and the right proposal to go forward with is can we, and if so, how do we articulate those things in the overlay language?
I think the other thing that came up, I think was a good comment, is that we might, though, in the design standards, talk about and make a specific reference to the depot building and the need to have setbacks and step down to respond to and set it off if there's any new development on those parking lots. So I think that is something that the design standards could tackle. I don't think that's a blanket reducing of the density in that thin zone all the way along the tracks, but I think within X number of feet of the depot, we could ask for certain massing adjustments to be made so that in the future, with full build out, that the building is set off in the way that it should be. So I think those are good comments. And Scott also asked about more careful consideration of some of the existing brick buildings. So we'll take a closer look at those as well, just to get those questions all kind of together.
Yes, and those are questions too that the steering committee members have brought up as well in regards to that building, but also the Van Ness building on the other side of River Street that also has historic character. So I think those are good. I did see hands up, but they're down now. So if you want to speak, keep your hand up and we'll call on you. Richard, I'm going to allow you to talk. Okay. Hold on. Sorry. Okay. You might need to unmute again. Oh, shoot.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, sorry, that clicked too fast. Yep.
Okay, so I'm just wondering, when you do the walkways on the waterfront, I mean, I've been on the Dammers Rail Trail and also the Newburyport waterfront. I was wondering if they have to be all concrete. Can there be like some sort of cinder down there so people can run along the trails without just running on concrete or walking on concrete, which is very bad for your legs?
Yeah, I think that there's in all those range of examples we were showing, we're just dealing with regulations and depths now. We haven't clarified our thoughts about how much of it is green, how much of it is path, is it impervious surface? Is it pervious surface, as you're mentioning, with, decomposed granite or cinders or things? Those are all things that I think through this process we're going to sort out. And it might be a case where the design standards, particularly for that open space, are generalized in this first project that we're doing, and then those details might get worked out with the first developer that then apply for the rest of the parcels. Some of the details might have to wait until there's a kind of, first person in line developer that begins to tackle these and the cost issues too. But I think your questions are good, and I support some of the considerations that you're raising here.
Thank you.
Let's see, Rich, if you could put your hand down when you have a chance. Chris Copeland, I will ask you to unmute.
Hi, Darlene. Thanks. Chris Copeland. We've done some development on Rantoul Street. I just have a kind of a generic question. I probably know the answer, but I wanted to ask it because if you're talking about density and you look at unit counts of 900, 1400, large amounts of units connected to other streets, is there a study of some sort being done about this whole area relative to traffic patterns in adjacent intersections, or is that left for each developer to sort of, study and figure out, or is that done on a broader scale in terms of traffic that might drive a certain, design notion one way or the other?
I mean, I don't know, Darlene, if you want to answer that, but I think it's a good question. I think knowing that the connection across the track at Pleasant and other kind of limited access points to get to points east complicates a little bit this area. We thought in general that 4/1 and then the kind of planning logics of what that would look like with limiting footprints at 30,000 square feet would result in slightly lower density development than what the market would like to build to max out high rise if the regulations were more lax. So we have tamped down the density a little bit, considering that issue, but there hasn't been a detailed traffic study, and it's not part of our scope. I think it probably would be the responsibility of each of the developers to, in a cumulative way, probably to do that analysis as part of their project approvals.
Right. I think that's typically how it's done. I just wonder how, if the overall plan is for 1,000 units, does that even fit? Is that even close to, working or fitting in the long term?
I think it's a really good question. I mean, I think partly it's tied to, which we haven't even gotten to yet, the parking ratio maximums that we would allow here to tamp down car ownership relative to rolling out of bed and getting on the train, and all of the positive attributes of being so close to the station. So those things are all interconnected anyway, and it's probably a question we can answer better when we start to discuss with the steering committee and the public things about questions about parking ratios and things.
Great, thank you.
I will take a question from Leslie Gold and then go back to the chat. Let's see.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Hi, Darlene and everyone. Thank you so much for this. I just want to say, first of all, excellent presentation. So much thought put into this. I really appreciate it. Well done. And I do love the polls, the questions, to get that information from the public immediately. My question is, as the chamber director for the Greater Beverly Chamber of Commerce, of course, it's business. You probably have, I'm assuming this is all, everybody knows that this is something that is coming. Where are we with regard to the business owners that are down there? What kinds of meetings are happening or will happen? And then overall, because there are so many residents, I'm sure, on this call, just like there are, I know that there are members of my board, et cetera. What's your timeline? Like, I realize that can fluctuate, but are we looking at a 5-year plan? I should probably know this, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, Leslie, it's a really good question. All the city's doing is recalibrating the rules for private developers to make their own decisions about the speed of implementation. And I think it's tied to a couple of the other questions this evening, which is this will then incentivize maybe some developers to approach private property owners and saying, based on the density and the scale the city is allowing, we think your property is worth X. Would you be interested in selling or not? So it's completely within the rights of private property owners to tell the brokers to get lost, right?
Tim, let me jump in for a sec, Tim, if I could also. Yeah. And thanks for the question, Leslie.
You're welcome.
As noted and discussed a lot over time, this has been a recommendation of 2 successive master plans. It was more on the back burner, I think, with the older master plan, because the Rantoul Street corridor was more ripe, I guess. So this is something that we've been talking about with several of the property owners along the Bass River for years. We've had several coming to us and saying, when's the city going to change the zoning? The family that used to own the Bolomat has already sold to a group that is interested in developing, as we know. The folks that own Desmond's, the folks that own Moynihan's, they've had conversations with us and expressed their interest in doing something, or selling what they've got. It's not to say that every property owner on that stretch is looking to change what they're doing and sell or redevelop. But it has been an open conversation for a number of years, and there's no I don't think there are any surprises in that sense. Is that helpful to your question?
Yes, absolutely. I just, this is such, really, it's such a fantastic vision. It's such an exciting vision. I'm sure, that's why you're doing it. It's such a game changer in so many ways. It's such a great economic driver. You can have all of these wonderful opportunities down there, from the open space to the retail and restaurants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm sure people are very excited about this first meeting, this process. So that's why I was curious. I assumed, yes, everybody knows, the businesses know down there that this is something that's coming. I just kind of wanted to get a thought about what's your kind of, what would you like to see in your timeline? And then what are the phases that you're envisioning for this process? Because I'm sure people are very excited. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I mean, as you heard earlier, in terms of proposing overlay language for the planning board and the city council to hear, consider, and act on, we're looking to have that process take place over the next few months. More work to do here for the next couple months, in hopes of being in front of those two bodies by the early part of April. I think we had scheduled this meeting to run till 8:30. Looking at the questions that are in the question and answer box, let's go right at them, Darlene, and see if we can get through those several questions. Folks, I think we'll go as late as 8:45, but we'll stop it then. I always want to make sure people have a good predictor for how long they need to be in a meeting in order to not miss something. So we'll adjourn at 8:45 wherever we're at. Let's see if we can work through those several questions.
Sure. I'm just going to go top to bottom. Some of them we have partially addressed already, but I'm going through and trying to delete them. But Michael Hakeem asked, why include and I think this was in reference to specifically scenario 3, but why include the TOD tier 3 piece in this scenario? Without it, a more substantial greenway can be achieved along the river connecting to the existing park. Very specific question. Maybe we can answer. I mean, my first answer would be, I think there's another question about that section, which is the section where currently there's a boat ramp and the car wash. So right now Margin Street already exists. And so there, the Chapter 91 zone is much smaller. It's 25% of the lot. That lot on the water side of Margin Street is pretty shallow. So I think they're 25 to 32 feet depth for the water dependent use zone in the event of redevelopment. So I think there was some opportunity to show, let's see. So I'm trying to think Yeah, so there was opportunity for development there. So I think they were, and Tim and Tuscany, you could touch on that. But I think you were just trying to show where the opportunity existed. The alternative would be, it could remain, we could choose or.
Yeah, we could choose a lesser dimension or go above that.
Yeah. Hopefully that answers your question, Michael. So we did address the question about adaptive reuse of brick buildings, but the other, there was a partial part of that question that was, how does the design standards and scenarios affect the active water dependent use of the existing boatyard within the overlay area? So if we move forward with an overlay district as we are, all of the existing uses have the ability and right to continue to operate, as well as to continue to expand under the underlying zoning. So we're not changing the underlying zoning under the current scenario. And that also, there are certain, so the water dependent use zone, we've been referring to it kind of loosely as public space, but it's important to note that it is actually, so development cannot occur in the water dependent use zone, but you can have water dependent uses. So a marina or a boatyard could continue to operate there. And it is actually a really important distinction to mention, because, as our vision and our goal is for this active linear park with open space and resiliency, it is actually, Chapter 91 would allow a water dependent use there. hopefully that answers that question. We had a couple of questions, so I will paraphrase because they seem similar, about connecting Odell Park and that park on one side of the depot over to the other side, to the waterfront, and in a more meaningful way. And also drawing that green space connectivity from the depot to the water, perhaps as an alternative to roads. Two kind of parallel questions, but very similar. I don't know, Tim, you're nodding. Did you want to speak on that? Or
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that as we refine the guidelines, I think thinking about the mix of bicycle and pedestrian only greenway connections versus vehicular greenway as a toolkit that developers can use will be important. Again, since this is going to be developed piecemeal, we have to imagine that the guidelines work as each slice of that zone between River Street and the waterfront is developed. So it's going to be a little bit harder to kind of master plan the whole thing, but set a series of rules. We can control much better the connectivity parallel to the water, where those ladder streets, as I mentioned before, we're going to have guidelines about their qualities and things, but their exact location will probably be contingent on what development projects do. But absolutely, I think we don't want these to be needlessly too many vehicular streets if we don't need them.
great, thank you. I guess this is possibly a comment or a question, but why the emphasis in the mission statement, I believe referencing the vision statement of the goals of the master plan on evoking the industrial history? We call ourselves the Garden City. I would much rather evoke a feeling of Rockport or Gunkwit. Green space and gardens should be fundamental and of all future development in Beverly. And I agree. And I think we've been, as a city, trying, we have some recommendations in our master plan that also seek to preserve the industrial areas in our city. I think a lot of people agree that having this scale and type of industrial development on the waterfront itself is not the highest and best use of these properties, but we do have other really nearby industrial areas that are kind of smaller scale areas where there's opportunities for innovation and for people to get started in light or heavy industrial businesses. And so the city's really seeking to balance that and maintain our diverse economy as well, and have a commercial base that allows for many different businesses to grow and thrive here. So I think that's the nature of the point you're referencing, is that, and I think it also referenced kind of a character of knowing that some of those buildings like the depot and the Nest Creative building might stay there. They have a different character than some of the newer development that we've seen on Rantoul. So is there a way to evoke that in a design of a building that kind of balances off the history from that area? Let's see. We have a question here. How do we get to more granular type of buildings and feel rather than big block type buildings like on Rantoul Street?
I think that that's the basis of the height and maximum footprint guidelines that we're starting to work with. I think one of the things we need to make sure, especially in the T4 and T5 districts, that we're getting this footprint right. And so we have to do a little bit more work on that. We want to incentivize development, but I agree that some of the buildings on Rantoul, in terms of their overall footprint, are too big. So I don't know if this is reassuring or not, but we're on that. How does that sound?
Sounds good. We have a question about, I think this relates to the poll. We had a question for net zero. Isn't net zero more of a builder concern? It will offset operating costs for residents and building owners, but how does that affect the amount of money available for some of the, or he says, I think that would, as the comment mentions, it's kind of a weighing. Is that more important than open space? I was going to ask Emily if she wanted to comment on that one.
Sure, and I think it will be. We are fairly close to being able to adopt, well, I shouldn't say, the state is fairly close to establishing their new net zero building code. And once that is completed, I believe the city is dedicated to adopting it, because we are dedicated to reducing our emissions, to meeting our goals as established in our climate action plan, Resilient Together. So that will be something that builders will have to address. In the interim, there will be standards that builders will need to meet. And we're continuing to work with developers in every project to help them meet those goals. But it is a cost. It is still an important cost that developers have to consider and weigh, and we have to work with them in that. So I think the answer is yes, and it's something we'll be continuing to look at very closely.
Thank you, Emily. I'm going to jump around a little bit just to get some comments from other people. A comment was made to preserve the essence, not necessarily the exact structures. Things should be allowed to evolve for the greater good. Another question, I don't think that requires an answer, but the Bolomat property will set the tone for future development. How will this potential project be affected by these design standards being reviewed by the city? So at the point, once we're working to adopt these design standards, so currently the zoning there is industrial. So we're working to write both and complete and have approved a Bass River overlay district that will allow multifamily zoning and mixed use on that property in this whole area. So up until that point, I would expect that the new owner of that project would be subject to the new zoning, because under the existing zoning, they would not be able to build a residential project. I think that answers the question. And we would hope that these design standards that we end up with will be in that new zoning overlay district.
Well, that's our plan.
That's our plan.
I mean, that's the point. That way it will apply
Yes.
to that potential project.
Can you talk a little bit more about the potential for new perpendicular streets, river to Bass River, to be designed for pedestrian traffic only?
Yes, I think we addressed that.
Catch that one?
Yeah,
Okay.
we addressed that, and I wholeheartedly support that, and we're going to do some more work to understand the minimum number of vehicular streets we need to provide access and address for the buildings at the scale that the footprints that we're recommending would, so there's a little bit of math we have to do to figure that out. Or there might be ways to incentivize non-vehicular streets as part of a set of design standards. Maybe some choices in the standards that say if you do this, then you can do this, or that kind of thing. The incentive structure might encourage that being a solution for developers as well.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and some of these, I hadn't scrolled all the way down, so some of these questions might have come in while we were talking. How does the substation play into this? It's an eyesore, but everyone loves having electricity. Mayor, do you want to take that? Yeah.
Substation isn't going anywhere. We all need our electricity. I think if you see the maps, I think they tactically leave it out. We do believe that the big giant parking lot that Grid put in to park their service vehicles can one day have a higher and better use, given that it's across the street from one of the handful of busiest train stations in the state. But the substation parcel or sub parcel, that really needs to be what it is. It's critical infrastructure in that sense.
The next question is somewhat new. Can the design standards look at shadows that would be cast by buildings, perhaps doing a study to inform where and how setbacks and street openings best preserve light to public areas?
We've already considered that. Maybe I don't know who's controlling the slides. The two cross sections we did through the Bass River, the waterfront open space, and the buildings, you'll notice that when the buildings are pushed back with the promenade street and the wider open space, they're at 5 stories. And so that relationship and scale of the 5 stories to the promenade and the park in a way being thought of as kind of the public realm seems appropriate and right. And then when the open space is smaller and we don't have a street, we're recommending 3.5 stories, and so or 4 stories. And so we haven't quite finalized the app, but if it's TOD3, which is 3.5 stories, imagine that upper floor is partly in a pitched roof. That's one reason why we brought those buildings down, because they seem to kind of crowd and cause shadow issues on the open space there. So that's already kind of part of the thinking. It's fresh thinking, but the reason why we step the buildings down as they come closer to the water.
Trying to go back, I lost my place. Thank you, Tim. So there's a question about the MBTA community requirements. So the housing choice law, well, part of the economic bill that was passed in January 2021, and the state came out with MBTA community requirements and draft guidelines in December. The question is, how does that impact Beverly, and what do we need to do? The capacity that the state had assigned to Beverly was that we need to have a zoning district within 50 acres in size, which is equivalent to about a half mile from a transit station that accommodates 3,500 housing units by right. Now, that doesn't mean new units. I just want to put that out there first. And that doesn't mean we have to actually build the units. We just have to have zoning that allows those housing units to be created by right. And I say just, but that's, not a just. The guidelines are in draft form right now. We've been attending webinars. There's a requirement that we demonstrate compliance or how we're going to become compliant by the end of this year. But as I said, the guidelines are not yet finalized, and it's a lot of work. I will be truthful, and we're hoping to get some technical assistance to help us do that through some of the state agencies. So that's definitely still very much a work in progress, but it does play into what we're doing here and talking about creating more opportunities for housing by right. I have another question. How do you create a financial incentive for developers to build smaller buildings? They would need to build more smaller buildings to get the same number of units. And I think that is something we all struggle with. I'm not sure that's one of the trade-offs that we've been talking about. We want all of these things. We want a developer to provide open space and affordable housing and infrastructure and green building, but yet we don't want the buildings to be as big, and that doesn't always financially pencil out.
Darlene, could we, as we go to the next one, let me speak first and maybe Tim can follow and help me out with this, because that rolls right into the crux of this for a lot of the neighbors, right? I mean, and so I'm looking at Sharon's point. Yep. How are we addressing the impact of building multiple larger buildings to the residents of Goat Hill, since we're the residents that will be impacted the most from overbuilding and traffic? I think, what we contend with collectively is this continued unmet need for housing. I know that the feel over the last several years is lots of projects. And at the same time, the new housing starts in Beverly for the first 15 years of the century was way below historic levels or averages. And so with the flurry of activity that has happened since we came out of the Great Recession, so really over the last 7 to 9 years, people are seeing that kind of unmet or pent up demand from earlier start to be addressed. And yet we still, both locally and regionally, have a significant housing shortage based on the need and the demand, throughout our region and here in Beverly. So how do we address it? Not only in the downtown, but how do we address it? TOD is the model where you can put more people you can build more residences by bringing fewer new vehicles. And I know that it doesn't mean you don't bring any cars. And I know that's a part of the concern that neighbors have. But when people live closer to some of what they need, both service-wise and transportation, then they're less likely to own a car. And for those who own a car, they don't use it as much. And those are some of the basic, tenets of transit-oriented development that are proven out time and again. As I said, I know that when you add new units, you're not bringing no cars. So Tim and team, do you want to talk a little bit about, how we're trying to right size what's here so that it is both, it creates the greatest public access to space, it limits the additional impact of traffic and so forth. And before I turn it over to you, I'll just say, we've been working all over town with very intentionally on upgrading and improving intersections, because when we do that successfully, and we're swapping out, for example, down at the Cabot Rantoul at the base of the street there by the waterfront, over at the Henry's intersection, other places, and we will be seeing a signalization at the corner of Bridge Street and River Street in the next couple of years as part of the Bridge Street project. Those rebuilds of those intersections are bringing in new technology that's software and camera driven to monitor and regulate the cycles of traffic, the cycles of the lights, replacing older, in the case of something that's already signalized, older technology that's not as responsive to that traffic movement and demand. So those are things that we're working on. We're also working to promote more of the transit, be the train, more micro-mobility. We've got a mobility hub that we've studied, and we're trying to install around the train station to have more people go around town, go throughout town and around town, whether it be bike, walk, bus, ride share, but less in their own cars. Anyway, some other thoughts about the zone and how we're trying to work it, Tim?
No, I think one thing that we could do is just map from the Bass River area kind of car trip desire lines to destinations. How are people getting to 128? What's the easiest route to go south to Salem? And just to do a little bit of spatial thinking about that, just to understand with the people that will be driving, how they're going to get out of this, new little neighborhood and go places where they're going to go. It's also amazing to me in the last 3 or 4 years how developers' thoughts about the amount of parking they have to provide on site has changed. I mean, even in the last 3 or 4 years, from we have to have 1.25 parking spaces per unit, or it's just not going to work, to I don't even think so the market is changing rapidly based on the impact of COVID, changing demographics about who's living wants to live near transit. And I think that the other thing is that there's going to be a kind of next a market change in car share too, beyond Uber, to a kind of Zipcar 2.0 that's going to also make car sharing very soon much easier than it was during COVID, when Zipcar and other car sharing companies had issues because everybody was at home. So I think that all of those kind of mobility options and how it impacts what the market wants to do, I think means that there's going to be less cars here than if we were planning this 10 years ago. But I do want to look at those kind of desire lines and just get a better kind of intuitive feel about what you mean about some of those comments. I think it's a good point.
Thanks, Tim. And I also want to follow up. I didn't wrap my comment about the intersections and signalization, I think, effectively. Just think about different intersections around town that have been improved in recent years. I used to avoid the Gloucester Crossing traffic lights every chance I could. Now they're much better, and I don't even think twice about getting in the queue in any of those directions and waiting my turn to go through those lights. I don't drive halfway around town to avoid them. The Brimble Ave and Sawyer Road double roundabout project, I and a whole lot of other people really tried to avoid those stop signs because they could back up brutally and you could be stuck there quite a while. And ever since the roundabout project has been built, there's a much better flow. So when we're successful with redesigning intersections, be it signalized or roundabouts or whatnot. When we're successful with those, we're able to make them safer and move more vehicles through more efficiently. And that actually builds capacity. So, it's an ongoing challenge, Sharon, and I know we've talked before, and I know a lot of the neighbors have the same feeling you do. We'll keep talking, and we'll look for a follow-up with the neighborhood as we did before the holidays to talk a little bit more about all this. So thanks.
I think this could be a question or maybe just a comment to note that we should consider, but I'd like to see some thought given to how we can connect Ryle side for pedestrians. We've talked a lot about connecting the depot and from the downtown side, but we have heard as well, in addition to this comment, there are people that live on Ryle side would like to be able to walk over to this area as well. And we've heard that. I have I think this is a specific question. Once design standards have been adopted, if the rezoning creates an overlay zone rather than a full rezoning, would developers be permitted to incorporate the standards into their redevelopment plans by right? I think we answered this. So in the if using the overlay zone, if you would like to take advantage of being able to build other uses than industrial, you would need to incorporate the standards. The standards would not apply to the underlying industrial zone unless we also change that zone. That's a quick answer to that one. Are other areas of Beverly, such as the three other active train stations, being developed as much as Bass River, Rantoul, Goat Hill, and Greater Ward 2? I mean, this has been discussed as well. A lot of this came up during the master planning process about looking at identifying other areas that could see development or redevelopment in the future. And this whole process here, although starting with Bass River and downtown, we will also be looking at future redevelopment for neighborhood commercial and design standards in other areas of the community. There are reasons why downtown is seeing more redevelopment in this area in particular. The train station is more active. And I see the mayor waving his hand, so I'm going to let him finish.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. And I'll do this, and then we should try to wrap in the next couple of minutes. So to Hannah's question, yes, there's been more going on downtown. We looked very closely during the master planning process. An example is the North Beverly corridor. We got North Beverly, Beverly Farms, and Montsart are the other three active train stations. And since there are twice as many trains at the depot, Beverly corridor, and don't believe that meaningful TOD redevelopment along that corridor is ripe yet, in the sense that since there are only half as many trains, if we were to try to promote and somebody were to build some TOD in that neighborhood, we might get an unintended consequence of people moving in there intending to use the train on a regular basis, only to find themselves then driving downtown to the depot for most of their trips because they want the twice as many options. And we don't want that to be, as I said, an unintended consequence. The transit needs to improve to support the development north of the depot. With that said, we did a housing needs analysis and a housing production plan about 3 and 4 years ago, and there are a number of recommendations there that we're looking at that could see some additional housing units created around the other train stations in the more near future than further out. An example is we have an ongoing effort around evaluating an accessory dwelling unit possible ordinance, and that may focus around the other transit stations as well. That's not something that is on the menu today or on the agenda today, but it's easy enough for you to get information from us, because that's Darlene, you should take a minute on that, and then we can wrap up, because that's also a study process right now, correct?
Correct. Yeah, so it's a very good point. We are looking at, where areas where the housing need can be met in other ways, at different scales, at different types of housing to meet a greater need. And that includes the accessory dwelling unit ordinance. Currently, we have an ordinance that only allows accessory dwelling units for family members. And we are working with MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, under a grant through the state to create a model ordinance or bylaw for accessory dwelling units. And also it's a very data-driven approach. So we'll be looking at, there'll be a tool that they've created. We'll be hopefully having a public meeting on that in, I think, late February, early March. There was a bit of a staffing change that's kind of put a pause on it for a few weeks. But the goal is to have a web-based data tool that will help us evaluate all the different parameters that go into an accessory dwelling unit, like parking, size of the unit, where they should be and could be located, and what the impacts of those are to the community. So it's a really interesting project. We have a large steering committee and have been working on it for a bit of time. And hopefully we will be able to get our website up, a website posted soon with more information on that, but look for a future meeting on that as well as one of the other options we're looking for, creating different types of housing. So I think we have really, we do have a question from Rachel on signage, on digital signs, which I think we'll answer that. I think directly to you, Rachel. It doesn't necessarily relate to this, but we are also working on updating our sign ordinance in the next year. So that will come up during that conversation as well. Just a reminder, and I think this probably popped up in the chat, but this call is being recorded. It's also being broadcast by BevCam. So they will have the video up on their page, and we will also post a link to the video on our website under the planning department, the link I showed you earlier. Please do sign up for the email list if you're interested in receiving updates on this project directly, and or submit comments through the email link, which goes to me, Darlene Wynn. We are hopefully able to save all the questions from Zoom. If not, we have copied them. And so that we will be able to have these as well, and we'll add them to our frequently asked questions document. And I don't know, with that, Mayor, do you want to wrap up? I want to thank the team for the great presentation and everyone for the really good questions.
I want to thank you, and we've prevailed upon everybody for almost 2 hours of their time tonight. I really want to thank everybody who's attended, offered comments, asked questions, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue with you. And our team that other than me, everyone here is an expert in planning and design. So they've taken a lot of good input tonight. We really appreciate it.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Great feedback.